it's a real pleasure for me to introduce the three panelists. We've got Mayor Marvin Rees, who's come, the Mayor of Bristol. I'm just looking whether he's in the audience or being mic'd up. Coming over from this side, okay. Come, sit. I think we've got seats, Greg. And also, perhaps coming from the other side as well, because I know she was stuck on the tube this morning, Gabriella.
I think she's just getting mic'd up.
She's getting mic'd up, okay. Well, while she's not here, maybe we can tell everybody who she is as she arrives. But I was going to start with you, Marvin. You're a great supporter of the Catapult, so thank you. And you're a Yale World Fellow, one of the founders of the UK's Cities Climate Investment Commission, 3CI, who we'll be hearing a lot about at the summit, so look out for that. He's also the co-chair of the UK Urban Futures Commission, which you co-chaired with Andy Haldane, who we're going to be hearing from a little bit later on today too. And Gabriella, well, she has that terrible tube experience this morning, but is now being mic'd up, is the visiting professor of policy and practice at the University College of London and founder and director of Experimentalista, a novel type of creative office for cities. And then our very own Professor Greg Clark, who is the chair of the Connected Places Catapult and the author of 10 books on almost every aspect of cities. And Greg trots around the globe giving tens of cities, hundreds of cities, I'm sure actually, advice and support in terms of how they can go about developing sustainable economic places and spaces. I'm just wondering if we've got Gabriella coming. 1 minute. Okay, so what I will do is set out what we want to say in this panel. Of course, our cities and transport systems face some huge challenges as we approach the second quarter of the 21st century. Population growth, we've talked about it in the fireside chat just now. Economic change, climate transition, every day the weather makes the news, and regional disparities when it comes to prosperity, investment and opportunity. So what I'm going to do is start with people on stage and wait for Gabriella. But if, Marvin, I can start with you. Can you tell us, given those grand challenges that place leaders are having to rise to, what does a connected place mean to you? And what does the vision of a connected place require of us in terms of leadership when it comes to rising to those challenges?
Well, to me, it means a place where people have relationships, right? Like genuine relationships, and obviously that goes across the social, across our economic as well. It means people come into physical proximity, share cultural spaces as well. That doesn't mean that everyone's the same. It is good to have spaces where we come together in all of our differences, and our differences are good things. And then the second part of your question was, how do we get there?
Yeah.
Well, I think remarkably, sometimes you've got to intend to go there. It feels that so much of our leadership is quite opportunistic. It's 1-2 year horizons. It's what someone some years ago described to me as wet finger politics. I wet a finger, stick it in the air, see which way the wind is blowing, and that's where I go. We've got to set out a destination. So in Bristol, as an example, we convened the city in a meeting about this size, actually, public, private, voluntary sector, faith organizations, unions. And over the course of 6 months, we set out, we agreed a description of Bristol that we wanted to be real by 2050. And that became our destination, as a city. And everyone has a collective responsibility for taking us towards that vision. And that includes, actually, an inclusive city. And it's a very soft word, but it's an incredibly powerful word, a city in which everyone has hope.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful way of thinking about, if you want to lead people somewhere, you have to tell them where you're going. Otherwise, you'll turn around and they haven't quite managed to keep up. Greg, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think we talked a little bit about connected places earlier, didn't we, when we were building a word cloud together. And I suppose the thing I would say, Erika, is that the urgency to connect places is becoming greater, partly because global population growth is driving a kind of spreading out of humanity. As population grows, we only have a limited set of choices about where people live and how they live. And if we don't exercise some choice, we end up with models of population spread that are completely unsustainable. So I've been doing a piece of work recently on kind of global railway systems, looking at a number of different cities as they grow, from the Grand Paris Express to the extension of the BART in San Francisco to the suburban rail loop in Victoria in Australia. And there's a massive growth in the building of orbital railways in city regions. And one of the reasons for that is because we have to find ways to contain population growth in ways that are socially inclusive, environmentally sustainable, and economically productive. And there are actually very few options about how we do that. So I see that as a kind of a big global demand for more connected places. I think, on the other hand, when we think about global urbanization and how things are changing, the choice for us is not between whether we have urbanization or not. I mean, I'm on the record of saying we'll have 10 billion people living in 10,000 cities by 2100, and we're in the century that produces that outcome. So if you think of those 10,000 cities, the choice is not whether we get 10,000 cities. The choice is what quality will they be. Will we get good urbanization, or will we get bad urbanization? And the role of transport and connectivity, digital and physical connectivity, is absolutely critical to the difference between good urbanization and bad urbanization, and where we can link things up. And then, of course, the other massive driver here is the climate emergency, which you've already referred to, and so did Peter, and so has Marvin. That, if you like, the climate imperative is producing this pinch point where we know we don't have enough public money to deliver the investment we required to decarbonize and to be resilient and to end the biodiversity crisis. So we've got to engage in public-private financing, which is part of connecting public and private money, public and private assets, something we're actually doing here in London at TfL with the new Places for London company. It's one of our partners here, which is taking TfL's land assets and turning them into a commercializable portfolio of connected living, connected retail, connected experience, connected EV charging as well. But at the same time, what the climate emergency is asking us to do is very much to do things much more quickly. You know, the urgency that's here is important, and that's giving rise to a whole set of new demands for how we use digital technologies, from digital twins to automated vehicles to virtual reality. Just think of one thing that I often think of, that if you want to achieve circularity in the built environment, you actually need digital twin technology to do it. Because if you can't passport different components of a building so that they have a life after their current life, you don't have the wherewithal to do circularization. So it's really critical how these connected technologies are creating the opportunity not just to have places that are connected, but places that are also sustainable.
Yeah, no, agreed. And I know we're going to talk a lot more about digital twins over the next 2 days, but also over the next year or so, as we try to build the work that we're doing on that. Gabriella, I don't know whether you heard the question, so shall I start again? Yeah. What does a connected place mean to you, and what does the vision of a connected place require of us in terms of leadership when it comes to rising to the challenges of our time?
Thank you so much. First of all, it's a joy to be here. It seems Mexican time is a thing, though this time from no fault of my own. Today we had a little bit of a fire, I think, on the Northern Line, so I've been power walking for the last 45 minutes.
Amazing.
So my brain might be racing along with my feet, but so a pleasure to be here. Funnily enough, I mean, I think this is obviously what brings us together is the question of connected places. But I will also state my biases. My new project is called the Institute for Everything in Between. And I do think that potentially in this coming age, first of all, we're potentially going to have to explore new worldviews in many ways, and just think about how entangled and symbiotic our lives have always been, but that potentially the story of modernity has been a story of separation, of humans separate from nature, of cities as standalones, et cetera, et cetera. So I actually believe that the big innovations to come are actually going to be relational innovations. It will be the relational question. It's, yes, absolutely, what are the places that connect us, the ways that we get connected in terms of transportation and technology, and simultaneously, what happens with the social structuring? How do we think about the density of cities, not only in terms of the amount of people per square meter, but actually the quality of the connections that there happen? When I was Chief Creative Officer for Mexico City, one of the things that we realized quite quickly as a very small team of 20 people with big ambitions was that our community was our superpower in many ways. And then just taking a glance at Mexico City, which is one of the major urban economies of the world, one of our public universities has 350,000 students. But in many ways, we realized that Mexico City is somewhat of a disjointed giant, if you will. So we had academia on one hand, we had private companies on the other, we had government, but there's also a lack of many times of a connective tissue that I think comes from what Marvin was just mentioning in terms of political imaginaries that can actually join us into a larger vision for a megalopolis in both the case of London and Mexico City. So what does it mean actually to reinvigorate political imagination? What does it mean when these are no longer visions that are monolithic in nature, but that actually use diversity, hyper-diversity, I'd say, as one of the biggest assets that city can have? And how do we start thinking about technology, connective tissues, and the way that we can do our thing? Urban imaginaries and cities themselves seems to be a fantastic holding space for complexity. So a little bit to add one of the things that what Greg was saying in terms of, let's say, private-public potential. One of the things that right now I am exploring with the Vice Presidency of Colombia in terms of the next generation care infrastructure is how do we add to that equation the possibility of popular, we call them in Spanish, público populares, so public civic alliances as well. How do we really think about citizen talent as one of the biggest underutilized resources that our cities have? And what does it take to actually shift from ideas of government as provider of services, the receiver of complaints, and really start thinking about the grand orchestrators for mission, cities on a mission, if you will. So I think, again, like potentially one of the biggest challenges as well as one of the biggest spaces of possibility will be how do we innovate on the way that we come together? How do we articulate every time broader societal visions that, again, are generous and generative in terms of the conception instead of extractive? Because I do think that, in many ways, the Enlightenment and modernist ideals and industrial ideals have taken us so far, but now with the climate change and many things, we're seeing that we have reached the edges of that paradigm. So what does it mean to articulate through different world visions, through collective capacities, a different type of worldview where cities will be at the centerfold because, we know it's 80% of the GDP worldwide. It's less than 3% of the planetary territory, but still like 75% of the resources the world over are used by cities. So what does it actually also mean to start thinking about transboundary governance, about transboundary thinking, if you will, in the case of the impact for better and for worse of our cities the world over.
Thank you. That's a really interesting way of thinking about it. And as we've got our sort of stick of rock of what we do here with our partners running all the way through that is people's experience. And I think we would absolutely be interested to hear more about how we can really harness that community element of what we do. Marvin, I wanted to come back to you and sort of build a little bit on some of the things that you've already said about your experience, but in your time in public office, where you've had to rise to some of these challenges at a local level and as well at a regional level and a national level, can you take us a little bit more through some of those examples or pick something, take us through?
So one of the big challenge in Bristol, among many, is housing, if I was to explain that. And when I came in, we had about 11,000 people on the waiting list. Today we've got 22. And that's not because we have failed to build houses. Actually, we've built more houses than the city's built in generations. It's just the population's grown so quick. And now we have the worst affordability ratio of any core city, and one of the worst outside London, probably with Cambridge, and it's about 10 times the average wage. Rents are out of control. So, and the consequences of that you can see spilling over. So this is, I heard the phrase once about London: the economy begins to eat itself. It's a product of success. We offer a good standard of living. We got green space within the city. You got access to the Brecons, thriving cultural sector, the new home with Channel 4, 2 world-class universities, all that sort of stuff. But now our hospitals struggling to recruit and retain. Our schools struggle to recruit and retain. And so we begin to get that challenge. So we came in with a commitment to building homes. Again, in a room like this, with a whole collection of organisations, we all agree that Bristol needs to build homes, and so we've set about building homes. But one of the challenges in a place is, and I shared this at 3CI and at the Catapult yesterday, never underestimate the potential of very small politics to get in the way of very big delivery. All right. You know how it goes, right? We used to talk about NIMBYs.
Yep.
Some in the room probably would have banana. They'll build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone. All right. And I have actually just paid a heavy political price for building homes.
Yeah.
I went for selection in Bristol, and I didn't get selected. And one of the big criticisms, he wants to build houses everywhere. Yeah, I do want to build houses. But, it's not, but I don't want to build houses. I want to solve the housing crisis.
Yeah.
And going back to the point you made earlier, Greg, the right kind of homes in the right places is one of the single most important determinants of the price the planet will pay for us, for hosting us in our growing numbers. When you talk about treading lightly, that means living efficiently. Efficient homes in places that allow for efficient transport and efficient connectivity, minimum resource use, reduction of waste, maximizing the reuse, recycling of waste within our underlying city systems. So that's where we've gone. But it comes, and you may want to get into it, it comes to a question: what kind of governance, how do we best organize ourselves to be able to take on the challenges that we now face? Because not all governments are equal in the face of the scale of the challenges and the speed at which we need to move to meet those challenges. But getting the city endorsement to take on housing is important. And I'll just share my final comment on this, because I did share it in my final speech last week in Bristol. Sometimes it feels as though we're not working with the same raw material. So there's a piece so I'll go to a meeting in Bristol, and I had about 300 angry people who didn't want me to build houses near them. But I said, before we are on the point of disagreement, can we go upstream and agree that if we're working with the same raw material? Do you agree we're living in a city that is only 42 square miles and we're not getting any more land? Yes. Do you agree there's a housing crisis? Yes. Do you agree we need to build homes? Yes. Well, then the next question is, where do you build them? And if you're going to say no here, you've got to say yes to there, or you must say do not build, and we'll live with the consequences of that. So the politics of a place is going to be, and the culture and the relationship is going to be incredibly important, along with our actual desire to solve these challenges.
Yeah, making those facts bear, driving those decisions is really interesting. I wanted to come back to you, Gabriella, and on that kind of city management leadership theme. As the former Chief Innovation Officer for one of the world's biggest cities, how do we innovate by creating platforms for experimenting in how we address some of these challenges?
I think this will also be one of the most critical infrastructures that cities can have, is spaces where we can test out new ideas at the same time that we mitigate risk from government. I don't think there's a single entry point for this incredibly grand challenge, if you will. So I actually think that we need to start thinking about relational infrastructures, which goes a little bit to the points that I made earlier, as well as what does it actually take for a city to create R&D capacity. And this is not only R&D for technology, but actually for society. I mean, a little bit to Marvin's point in terms of the fact that we now have to consider planetary boundaries or cities' boundaries. can we start also prototyping and rehearsing other ways of living, being, and belonging to our cities that are just as evocative, that are just as interesting as the ways that we have felt are akin to our lifestyle nowadays. So basically, one of the things that I feel could be really interesting is, first of all, to take a look at what already exists. What are the resources and the spaces and the territories that already act as experimental innovation engines? And this could be everything from obviously universities to companies, but then also there's cultural infrastructure as well. And museums could actually be such an interesting place to be able to rehearse other urban futures in many ways and get a transdisciplinary and creative, imaginative lens on what can happen within the folds of a city. Now, going to my first point, I think that this also needs to be connected, because many times these things happen isolated from the others. And what does it actually entail to be able to have larger urban visions and then allow for an emergence to happen? Because experimentation, there is a difference between innovation and experimentation. Experimentation is we don't know the outcome. And so this implies risk. It implies a certain type of boldness, but it also implies that the world that we're living in right now, you know, we have, as I mentioned, come to the edge potentially of a paradigm. So what does it mean to experiment our way forward, to be able to mitigate risk collectively as society, and at the same time to be able to both utilize the infrastructure that could actually be augmented if we connect it and we think about it even more deeply of the place that it could have, as well as to invent new infrastructure that might be needed. And this could be everything from cities as experimental territories where certain neighborhoods could actually be able to test out new ideas. Like when I was advisor for the mayor of Seoul for 5 years, Mayor Park Kwon-soo, they actually had specific neighborhoods where people could test out everything from new technologies to new housing possibilities, et cetera, et cetera. And simultaneously, potentially within government, because as anybody that works in government knows, it's actually quite costly politically to take risks. Yeah. So what actually ends up mitigating the risk of this experimentation on behalf of a society is, I think, also one of the big questions. So in sum, deepening and interconnecting the R&D infrastructure that already exists with a larger city vision, and second, understanding where the gaps are, where we could actually fill them in, as well as how do we learn from other cities. Like, I love this idea of activist cities, of cities that are nowadays learning from each other, where innovation becomes, as Greg knows and Marvin has proved, like contagious in many ways. When we crowdsourced the Constitution in Mexico City, then there was also an international conversation about what constitutions at a city level and our highest law nowadays actually entailed for cities. So I also think that there's a beautiful potential of cities having very deep conversations that many times actually are from city to city and bypass often national conversations even.
It's really interesting, your discussion around risk, and I wonder whether in the work that we're doing around digital twins, where we can recreate things in a sort of almost risk-free environment. I know it needs that kind of bold investment in the data and the infrastructure, that digital infrastructure, but definitely allowing us to maybe have a go at a few scenarios before you then put it into a real-life situation. But I think that's a really interesting idea. Greg, from a global perspective, looking at the future of both connectivity and place, what's new in the current cycle?
Gosh, what's new in the current cycle? Well, can I just frame this for a minute and say, you know, my starting point for thinking about this is 1980 to 2080. There's a lovely 100-year cycle there. During that cycle, the world's urban population goes from 2.3 billion to 9.3 billion. That's a multiplication of 4. We go from 275 cities of 1 million to 1,600 cities of 1 million. That's a multiplication of 6. We go from 43% of the small urban population in 1980 to something like 81% of the much larger world's population in 2080 living in cities. That's the trajectory that gets you to 10 billion people living in 10,000 cities by 2100. And of course, the good news is, if anybody in this room is in the transport built environment, local government, or allied tech industries, wow, you're in a boom industry, right? We're all building cities all over the world. And there's a big kind of global innovation imperative. And Marvin and Gabriella have both made the point, in a way, that the underpinnings of innovation in this space are not just technology, but I will talk about technology in a minute. It's social capital. It's the thing that Gabriella was talking about in detail, and it's the thing that Marvin exudes when he talks about convening the whole of the city to develop a shared vision. That's about social capital, the ability of any place to digest and metabolize innovation is a function of its social capital. If you don't have social capital, you have no agility. So that's really the key thing. I wanted to say two things then about the trends from the global space, which is that I think that this rapid urbanization path is producing 4 new very big urban economies in our world. The first is the innovation economy that many people in this room are familiar with, about the commercialization of research, development, technology, and other kinds of experiments. And Gabriella's made that point very clearly. If you like, the process of innovation, of creating new kinds of value, is increasingly an urbanized industry, which is very, very important. The second one, of course, is the sharing economy, this idea that digital platforms make it possible for us to shift from a model of ownership to a model of use and sharing. The third one, of course, is the circular economy. We began to talk a little bit about the role of digital twins in circularity a few minutes ago. That's a really key growing industry. And then the fourth one is the experience economy. And we've talked about people's experience as being the key things. But the experience economy itself is, in a sense, the global antidote to the kind of robot world, right? Where the more things become routinized and digitized, the more it's important to provide a premium complementary experience in real space. So what I would call face-to-face or face-to-place experience, that experience economy. And of course, if you're in the business of transport, the experience economy, the circular economy, the sharing economy, and of course the innovation economy are right at the heart of how our transport systems are changing and how they're connecting up. So I think that's one big trend. And then the other one I would say, and this sort of goes a little bit to what both Marvin and Gabriella was saying a minute ago, is that, if you like, in the first 3 decades of this century of urbanization that I've described, we relied a lot on what I would call public governance, national policies, regional governments, local governments. And we thought that, you know, we're facing this challenge, we've got this climate emergency, the world's rapidly urbanizing, we need better government, and better government will do it. I think what's happened is that we've realized that although government has been quite good at articulating the challenge, actually government on its own has not been very good at mobilizing the resources or the innovation to make things work. And as a result, a space has opened up in which 3 other things have become very important, and very quickly they are what people in the room know them to be. Number one is it's about exponential technologies and how we use them to solve the problems that Gabriella was talking about and Marvin's alluded to, how we use technology to serve the urban century so that we get good urbanization and not bad urbanization. The second one is intentional capital. What's happened, I think, in all of the big financial institutions and all of the big corporates is a realization that this urbanization journey is an opportunity, but it comes with massive responsibilities for them. And that's why we've seen the growth of sustainable finance, impact investing, ESG, green bonds, all of this wall of capital that start to emerge. Is a response to this, but it has very specific kinds of requirements. And if people want to talk about that, join us in the 3CI sessions later. And then I think the third new big trend is what I would call the art of place leadership. In other words, I think we've moved away from the expectation that government does everything, and we've started to think about this concept of ecosystems as it relates to leadership and governance and places. So when Marvin convenes Bristol to have that conversation, he's not just convening City Hall and his fellow councillors, he's convening the private sector, the institutional sector, the civic sector, and most importantly, the citizens who bring with them the social capital. So we have new ideas about distributed leadership, collaborative leadership, leadership that shares the risks in the way that Gabriella was describing. It's that place leadership that creates the conditions in which experimentation and innovation can occur. So I think those are the big trends.
Amazing, thank you. I'm going to move to Slido again. So people have been popping questions in, both I think in the room and online. There's an interesting question here, Marvin, which I think it would be great if you could address, which is about the governance structures. And the person says, is our governance structure capable of addressing the strategic problems we face, in particular the complex structure of English local authorities, and is this helpful?
No, it's not, no. So,
quick answer.
So if I talk nationally, the image, I used to box, right? The way I see it is like national government is like a 50-year-old boxer who doesn't know that they ain't got it in them anymore. It's just not equipped, and yet it retains and sucks in power, right? So it's a bottleneck. We are the most centralized democracy in the Western world, right? And I'll give you an example. This is a real life example. Temple Quarter Enterprise area is one of the biggest regeneration schemes in Europe right now, right? We pulled together, in line with what Greg said, universities, Homes England, Network Rail, Peter Hendy was on it. We had cross-party, Tim Bowles, my Metro Mayor's Conservative. We all were together since 2017 working on this scheme. I was in MIPIM with government, and at MIPIM they described it as one of the most exciting regeneration opportunities in Europe in 2018. When you think we got the money to kick it off properly? At 2021. It took, like, for all those years, I phoned up and asked if I needed to put a different tie on or do an interesting handshake. We all knew it was right there, and I constantly get assurances, and it was just slow to get out. So it's not. And the work that you alluded to earlier on with the RSA on the Urban Futures Commission asked 3 questions: what are cities? What do we need to do? What do we need to do? What do we need them to be, and what do we need to do to get them there? This is not a party issue. Michael Heseltine's talking about the same thing. How do you unlock the power in all these places so that they can move and flourish? And I think cities can move with a dynamism that national governments can't. Climate change, another one. Anyway, cut that short. The other point is locally, as you talk about place leadership. Bristol is not the result of any single organisation's decisions. What people receive in Bristol is the product of the interaction of all our decisions. I don't run a health service. Our universities are small towns in Bristol, have big private sector, voluntary sector. I have no command and control power over that. So you have to find a way of moving, the way I describe it, from local government to place governance. Governance says we are collectively responsible for this, and it's not hard power, it's soft power. Building that is an art. It's obviously you've got to do things, but it's about building the culture. That's what we've tried to do in the city.
Amazing. As we run to the end of this panel, I just wanted to use one more question that has come in online and address it to both Greg and Gabriella, because I think it's quite timely question. In practice, given the kinds of things that we're hearing from Marvin too, how do we reinvigorate political ambition and connect this to the will and vision of the people? Gabriella, do you want to address that question?
That is a great question that speaks to my heart in many ways, because I think that many times when we're thinking about government and governance, we sometimes forget the emotional quality of cities and societies. So I actually think that one of the best ways to actually articulate society around the common goal is to have missions that are compelling and juicy and really speak in a polyphonic fashion to the many people that need to be involved to actually get somewhere. I think the types of visions, for example, for cities, we called it visions for a megalopolis. It's also interesting if in and of themselves they can break through silos, because let's say one of my teams when I was still in Mexico City government was the pedestrian city team. And we articulated a whole ecosystem around pedestrian city. So the interesting thing is, who owns the pedestrian agenda for a city? Is it the transportation department? Is it public space? Is it urban planning? Well, it's actually a bit of everything. So this actually is also an excuse in an interesting fashion to have government articulate within in a different form, and then also to start finding out and figuring out who could be the potential allies. So for example, in terms of pedestrian, because as you probably know, this is the leading cause of death of children and adolescents the world over, especially in cities, is actually traffic incidents. So it's of drastic proportions and consequences. And so one of the things that we found is that, for example, the insurance agencies, the third largest insurance agency of Mexico, had 3 times more data than the Mexico City government. So what does it then actually mean to start scaffolding collaborative spaces, architecture for collective life? What does it mean that data trust can be built, that actually it's not only the government in and of itself articulating within, but also finding what the connective tissue to articulate without also entails. And then we also partnered with the activists, which are just so knowledgeable. So they actually ended up passing, very much based on what we did in Mexico City, mobility is a right for the first time on a national constitution. So from 40 organizations that we work with, they became 70. So all this to say, I think that there's nothing that is more self-propelling, that allows for a city on a mission to acquire life of its own, if you will, than to be able to have something that truly speaks to the heart of what many people around the table could actually look for in terms of collective visions for collective life.
Amazing, thank you. Greg, I'm going to ask you to say the last word, actually, which I want you to focus on that political ambition and the will of the people and how we can reinvigorate that.
Well, I think actually Marvin and Gabriella have given us good examples of it. I think you have to reframe crises as choices, and you have to give people their agency back. I'm going to give you 2 very quick examples. I'm working with 7 Spanish cities at the moment about the crisis of tourism in Spain. And the way they conceive of this problem is that you either have tourism and it's awful, or you don't have tourism. Actually, there's a third choice, which is to create the tourism you want and to be very intentional about it. And then there's another place where I'm working at the moment, which is a modest project that's looking at the cities of the Amazon. 47 million people live in the Amazon. There's 116 cities and towns, 20 of them are large cities. President Lula makes, I think, the very important point that the world thinks it owns the Amazon rainforest, but actually it's the 47 million people who live in the Amazon. So you've got to frame their choices. And so you've got to develop a form of urbanization that gives them incomes and a quality of life that creates a disincentive for them to engage in deforestation. So it's about giving people choice. It's about turning crises into choice. It's about agency. That's how we build social capital. But that's also how we create much more cohesive patterns of distributed governance in the way that Marvin was describing. So I think that's at the core of all of it.
Amazing, and thank you for that as the final word. I just want to say a great big thank you to Marvin, Greg and Gabriella. Thank you very much for spending the time with us this morning.